Lithuanian Resistance in World War II. Throughout history, wars have ravaged through normal human lives. Kingdoms, nations, countries fallen underneath another nation's control. From the Roman Empire to more recent conflicts like World War II and the Russian-Ukraine war currently raging on, however, from the rubble of an invaded territory is usually faced with a resistance from once a free nation. This especially happened during World War II, with the majority occurring in Polish and Soviet forces. However, one nation which also featured resistance was Lithuania. This video will summarize the history of Lithuanian resistance, both underneath the swastika and the hammer and sickle. It begins way back in 1939. The Soviet government compels the Lithuanian, Estonian and Latvian states to agree to mutual assistance pacts, which would have given the Soviet army ability to establish military bases there. However, on June 14, 1940, the Soviet government gave an ultimatum to Lithuania to allow Soviet troops to establish a pro-Soviet government in their country. They were given 12 hours to respond to the treaty, which Lithuania didn't get as the Soviet troops started to occupy Lithuania. Whilst the Red Army slowly pushed through, the Lithuanian army was told to stand down and exchange friendly greetings, whilst Air Force was commanded to stay on the ground. On June 16th, identical ultimatums were sent to Latvia and Estonia, however were only given 8 hours to respond. They all followed the same fate as Lithuania eventually. They all became under Soviet spheres of influence, where then the elections were rigged towards Soviet supporting governments, which then were accepted into the Soviet Union. President Antanas Smetona, the previous president of Lithuania before occupation, and some other members of the legal government fled towards Germany as he didn't want his own government becoming a puppet of the Soviets. Russians tried to recapture him. This was unsuccessful as Antanas then settled in the USA. Soviets began their rigged elections, which led into the full annexation of the Lithuanian territory. However, only 15% of the eligible voters cast ballots, and many voted for a cartoon character. According to other sources, apparently the turnout rate for the ballots was 95%. However, most were blank, missing, or filled with anti-Soviet slogans. Since the occupation occurred in August 1940, both passive and armed resistance forces began to covertly organize. There were also passive resistance as explained in ballots, however most of the country partook in this. Soviet political parties and parades were barely attended by the population. Portraits of Lenin and Stalin were actively stolen from public places. Concerts from the Red Army Chorus were interrupted by patriotic mass crowds singing national Lithuanian songs. High schools and colleges became sources of sedation. Lithuanian flags and other national flags started to appear out of nowhere. However, the Soviet government began to round up loads of the activists. The Lithuanian Activist Front. On October 9, 1940, the Lithuanian Activist Front, also known as LAAP, was formed as a coordinated resistance group in Kaunas, a major city in Lithuania. It was led and founded by Colonel Kazys Skripa, an exiled Lithuanian minister. It was organized in both Kaunas and Vilnius. However, there were hundreds of three-group cells of men across the country. The eventual goal, after leadership determined the conditions were right, was to incite a revolt with arms that were stockpiled and with necessary plans made. LAP became a unified resistance command, absorbing notable resistance groups as the Iron Wolf, a fascist resistance group, and the Lithuanian Freedom Army. According to a source, LAP grew to the strength of 36,000 members. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany began Operation Barbarossa, which was an invasion of the Soviet Union. This news of an invasion spread like fire across Lithuania, and the major cities were liberated by LAP members. Retreating Soviet troops were harassed. Lithuanians believed their country was restored. Finally, peace was finally achieved in the Lithuanian fields, until the German army arrived. They soon disbanded the government and formed an administrative region known as Ostland by Reichskommissar Heinrich Losche. Adrian von Rentler was appointed the Reichskommissar of Lithuania. German policies were maintained horribly, with 100,000 Lithuanians required to fulfill labour quotas. Only 5% were fulfilled, however. Gestapo and SS troopers resulted to abdication of Lithuanian youth for labour in Germany. They also prosecuted Lithuanians who were considered threats to the occupation, with thousands jailed and executed, which resulted in the LAP to be suppressed and many of its leaders jailed. Finally, 200,000 Lithuanians of Jewish origins were deported or killed. However, the number would have been higher without the help of Jan Zwartejik, a Dutch consul in Kaunas, and Shinsei Shukira, the Japanese consul in Kaunas, and his wife Yukio, who both saved thousands of Jewish refugees from Poland by granting visas in 1940. However, the resistance from the Soviet era still remained, lurking underground like a bear trap underneath some leaves. A wrong foot in the direction from Germany would result in a devastating and painful retaliation from the Lithuanian resistance. LAP was struggling. Without a leader, they were disrupted. Small political and guerrilla resistance groups slowly formed underground, however, without a concrete leadership or organization. Over time, however, resistance groups grew stronger and more effective. The Union of Lithuanian Freedom Fighters, the Lithuanian Front, was formed in 1941. In 1942, the Lithuanian Unity Movement and the Lithuanian Freedom Army were organized. And even the Lithuanian Nationalist Party, which was partly cooperated with the Nazis, had joined the underground resistance because their party was silenced by the Nazis. These groups of resistance began to wage a war against the Nazis in loads of different forms. However, the fear that the weakened Nazi foundation in Lithuania present could eventually backfire if the Soviets decide to push back into Lithuania. With a weakened resistance group and an even weaker Nazi occupier, the Soviets would be able to push back into Lithuania just like they did in the 1940s. One of the most important parts of the resistance was the false collaborating local governments. Dr. Germantas Masaukas, the Council General of Education, worked hard to keep the Lithuanian culture and the educational institutions from the hands of Nazification. He was then deported to Stuho concentration camp after 2 years of covert resistance, where he sadly died. Furthermore, 5 of the 9 members of the Council Generals ended their lives at the camp. Secondly, the Lithuanian police. They retaliated against the authorities and made it hard to cooperate with them. The Germans had been experiencing manpower shortages, requiring Lithuanians to become policemen instead. However, this would cause pain to the Gestapo, as they cooperated with resistance by disposing of evidence, protecting resistance agents, providing advance notice of Gestapo and police raids and searches. This meant at times the resistance was protected from the Gestapo. Underground newspaper. One other major part of the Lithuanian resistance was the introduction of extensive underground press. One of the first manifestations of these publications was the distribution of brief bulletins of news and resistant literature. This became insanely popular because Lithuanians barely got accurate news from official sources. Eventually, full newspapers appeared, however, printing was of great difficulty. All underground factions, it didn't matter if you were non-violent or violent, were issuing these. One popular newspaper had 20,000 in circulation. The Gestapo tried fiercely, however the goals by the newspaper agents were completed. They wanted unity of underground factions, uncensored news about events abroad, and communication between leaders and the people. Whilst war raged on in the east, millions of lives would be lost. Germany had to mobilize more men, but such a task would require a willing population. Withdrawal of the Italian, Hungarian and Romanian armies occurred, and only the German army was there to take its place. Spread out thin, they began to tap into other populations in their occupied territories. One use of these new populations was the creation of SS legions, which were volunteers from foreign countries that would be given equipment and form a basic division. Legions happened in Estonia and Latvia, but not Lithuania. However, Germany estimated that Lithuania could provide 250,000 soldiers, which was more than the amount used on D-Day. However, what wasn't taken into account was that Lithuanians had a fierce, independent nature, and their recruitment drive was bitterly opposed by Lithuanians everywhere. In fact, Poland and Lithuania were the only nations under occupation that did not have an active SS legion. Any Lithuanians that drafted into the army deserted. In fact, it was one of the highest desertion rates of any group during World War II. As a result of this, resistance grew harder. This was the first part of the Lithuanian Resistance series. Next video will be about the continuation of resistance and their consolidation. I hope you enjoyed the video and subscribe.